George Kalomeris, we really don't know much about him. He wasn't famous like O.J. Simpson. He wasn't wealthy like Robert Durst, two other famous alleged criminals for O.J. Simpson, but convicted felon for Robert Durst. We do know, though, that he was a cold-blooded killer. He seemed to be just an average Joe, so to speak, married to a beautiful younger woman, Noreen. They lived in different states, so they moved around. They lived in North Carolina, Maryland, Delaware. Not unlike a lot of people, you kind of move to where your life goes. They had modest means. They lived in apartment complexes, and it is there in North Carolina that they met their very first victim, Gary Wayne Thomas. We do know that George liked to get high, and he would do so with Gary, his first victim. We know that he liked money, and we know he was willing to kill even a second time after he blew through most of victim number one's money. And this average married Joe was so envious of the lifestyle of the rich that he resorted to a life of murder to defraud these two different wealthy men as a crime of opportunity. The sin? Envy. Envy is defined as the desire for oneself and to destroy for another's good fortune. You want what someone else has. Resentment. In this case, this is the why behind the crime, the motive. Thank you for joining. I'm Ashley Willcott. As a TV anchor, a former judge, a trial attorney, I can tell you that almost every case that I've covered over the many years I've done this intersects with one of the deadly sins. Pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. These are the opposite of the seven heavenly virtues. Temptations that, taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we do break down the case of George Kalomeris and how the deadly sin of envy turned a seemingly average husband with a beautiful younger wife murderous. A little later, I'm joined by Josh Schiffer, criminal defense attorney extraordinaire, one of my closest friends, and we will take a deep dive on the how and the why of this notorious crime of the 1990s. In 1996, Gary lived in an apartment complex in Greenville, and he made friends with some other residents. Of course, those residents were George Kalomeris and his wife, Noreen. Then in July of 1996, Gary suddenly went missing. But those large chunks of money that went into his checking and savings account from his trust every month, well, that still kept happening. And the money trail indicated that he must have just up and moved and was living off of his trust. That was in 1996. So it was a real surprise to everyone when 2 years later in 1998, his remains were found by the police. Cause of death? Gunshot wounds. Manner of death? Homicide. He'd been shot to death by an unknown assailant. In murder cases, you know that the timeline is crucial to understand what happened. In this case, then, after that first victim, Gary, disappeared in 1996, we need to understand what happened before his body was discovered 2 years later in 1998, because during that time, there was a second victim. On August 15th of 1997, a paraplegic, Thomas Wayne, and important to know, Thomas Wayne Jones was a wealthy paraplegic. He was found lying naked in a field in Milford, Delaware. Now, although he was gravely injured, he'd been shot in the neck, he survived, and he was able to tell the police that it was George who shot him in the neck. How did he know it was George who did this? Because George's father and stepmother owned property next to the paraplegic's home. And he could identify George. He knew George. So he told the police that George broke into his house. He shot Thomas in the back of his neck, and then he left him to die in the field nearby. He said that the defendant in this case cleaned up all of the evidence and stole collectible gold coins from him, a checkbook, and bank account information that he had in his house. So the police start investigating, and during the course of this investigation, here's what they found out about George. George had been living with Noreen, again, his beautiful younger wife, in Silver Spring, Maryland. When he was arrested on August 20th of 1997 for attempted first-degree murder of his second victim, Thomas, at that time, they had a search warrant, and they searched George's home. That's when they discovered the first victim, Gary's, bank records. Because remember, Gary disappeared in 1996, and on July 15th of 1996, this is what the records told them. George had sent a letter to Wachovia Bank pretending to be Gary and told the bank, hey, I've moved from Greenville, North Carolina to Maryland. He also mailed an actual letter to the bank and said that he needed money for a vacation and a car. Between November of 1996 and August of 1997, George and Noreen, his wife, forged and cashed multiple checks from Gary's account, that first victim, for their benefit. Now, they also withdrew about $4,000 from an ATM in suburban Maryland in May of 1997 from that first victim's checking account. So this guy, George, he's arrested, but he's not done yet. While he's in prison, he orders a hit on his second victim, Thomas, because remember, although he shot Thomas in the neck and stole a lot of his stuff, Thomas lived. Thomas testified against George. And after he testified against George, George wanted him dead. George offered another inmate, somebody you can really trust, right? $10,000 to kill Thomas. And he even paid him $500. Now, first of all, he's trusting another inmate, of course, who ratted him out in exchange for a deal. But second, he paid that down payment in $500, five $100 bills that were sent, and the return address was his home address where he lived with Noreen, his wife. Victim number 2, sadly, Thomas, did succumb to the injuries from the gunshot wound that he sustained at the hands of George. So according to the investigations, here's what unfolded. George had befriended victim number 1, Gary, while he was living in that apartment complex in North Carolina, in Greenville. And during conversations, he learned about the trust fund. They like to get high together. And so while they were getting high together, he realized this guy had a lot of money and assets in a trust fund. So he decided to murder him and steal his identity. After he shot him and got access to all of his financial statements, he also canceled the health insurance of the first victim. He sold the first victim's car for $5,000, and he stole money from his accounts for a 2-year period. So it was when he started to run out of that money that he decided to shoot and ultimately kill, because he did die from the wounds, his second victim, Thomas. George Kalomeris was indicted in Delaware for the murders of Thomas Wayne Jones and Gary Wayne Thomas. And by 1999, he actually pled guilty to an 18-count indictment. That included homicide, solicitation to commit murder, money laundering, and bank fraud. And he even agreed as part of that deal to direct the police to Gary's skeletal remains. On November 18th of 1998, the police recovered those remains. George was sentenced to almost, get this, 400 years, so 395 years in prison for both murders and all those other charges in that 18-count indictment. He actually died at a pretty young age. He died at 59 in prison, and that was while he was serving his almost 400-year sentence. He died on October 10th of 2015. My friend, Josh Schiffer, defense attorney extraordinaire, but also, Josh, I think you have a photographic memory because I just mentioned as we were talking before this, you know a little bit or a lot about everything, and you have this thirst of knowledge for all things. So let me set the stage, and then I want to get all your many thoughts and expertise because, my belief is envy made him do it. Of course, we're talking about George, and George couldn't control his envy, his desire for himself to destroy another's good fortune and take it for himself. He wanted what his victims, two victims, Gary and Thomas, he wanted what they had. And he resented they had it, so he murdered and then took all of their money, their belongings, the things that he could benefit from. He was willing to kill for it. To do that, he had no problem living in various states. He had no problem killing them and then stealing their identities. Never mind that his second victim, Josh, as you know, was a paraplegic. He shot him in his neck, left him to die naked in a field, and then he later died from those wounds, but not before he testified against George. So these were both crimes of opportunity. He found someone, met someone where he was living in North Carolina who happened to also be a trust fund kid. And then he, knew this person, but also knew he was a wealthy paraplegic, moves next door to the properties that his family owned, and then took all his stuff. So let me turn it over to you. I know you've seen it. These deadly sins that cause people to do horrible things. What makes them cross that line, Josh?
You really do get back to one of our cultural touchstones of wrongness, and that's envy. And there's a reason that it is one of our core central sins that we teach our children about, that is ingrained into our community, that you shall not be envious of other people, and that envy is a danger to your happiness, to your well-being as a person in society today. And this is the perfect example of how envy leads people to a tragedy, a self-imposed tragedy, a tragedy that they're going to say, I couldn't stop myself. They're going to have so many different ways to mitigate or excuse their behavior. But when you get back to the end of the day, this is a case about have and have not and want, because we have someone who sees the wealth and success of others. And I think that it's very easy to conclude that it wasn't just the wealth. We see wealthy people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
What we had here was unearned wealth, was wealth that was arbitrary, wealth that was successful. And I think that's what ties both of these murders together, is the fact that George saw these two individuals have the money, have the success, have deposits just appear, and how frustrating that made George. And I imagine there's bitterness in addition to the envy there, because when George acted, he acted against people that were going to keep getting money regardless. And that's exactly what George did. We're talking about a murder based on wanting to get what's theirs and get that for free as well.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we had.
It is exactly what we had. And I'm thinking about how he met his first victim in this case, Gary. So George and Gary lived in the same apartment complex, and George was married to Noreen, who also committed crimes with him. But it's funny to me because they like to get high together. And I'm just envisioning, if you're doing that, you may start thinking, how's he affording this? How's he buying this? What? Oh, and maybe this guy had enough money to say, hey, come smoke with me. Let's hang out. And so I think that's the seed. I think that's where it can start, this thought process of, wait a minute, how's he living this life he's living?
Exactly. You're sitting there doing the puff, puff, pass with your buddy, And you got to wonder, how does he get here? You know your own story, and your own story of work or struggle or whatever it is brings you to this place in your life. And here for George, it was this apartment complex where he's sitting around smoking weed with a guy, and they're getting to know each other. And it turns out that the guy with the weed, the guy that he's sitting there with, gets a check every month. A totally different set of circumstances that for someone who's never experienced generational wealth or has never seen generational wealth, it breaks all the rules. What do you mean you get up on the first day of the month and you're already paid? How do you have struggle with that? If you come from a family where there wasn't that support, where that support just doesn't exist because you're not coming from a family with, generations of land ownership or education or financial success. You're coming from a family of hard scrabble roots where you've got to raise yourself up, and you're presented with this individual who is the opposite, who
Let
who
me
who doesn't struggle.
Right, right. But let me fast forward because that paints a great picture of kind of where this started and the envy, and it causes two murders from this individual. But I want to fast forward to the end of it because I think of someone like an Adam Montgomery who was convicted of killing his own daughter, Harmony Montgomery, but he still will not say where her remains are. So that body still hasn't been found. The mother recently was in the news because she's looking in a new area trying to find the body, the remains of poor little Harmony. But in this case, he pled to an 18-count indictment at the end of the day. And as part of his plea deal, he actually told them, this is where you can find the remains of my first victim, Gary, who was missing for 2 years. And sure enough, they found Gary's remains. So how do you, in this particular case, why do you think, Josh, at the end of the day, he pled guilty and he even said, hey, this is where you can find him?
I think that really comes down to how aggressive and properly produced the state's case is. So when the
Ah.
state comes up and is going to prosecute someone, especially when there's missing facts and really needed information, such as the location of a body, that becomes, at the analysis of wants and needs, a really high want. So when the state approaches a prosecution, and everybody, this is really fundamental stuff, there's the idea of the wants and needs analysis. Everybody has wants, everybody has needs. If you're in any kind of a negotiation, one of the first things to do is categorize what are the things we need to settle this dispute versus what are the things we want to settle this dispute. And when you're working on behalf of someone accused of a crime, your need is generally going to involve treatment. How much time in prison? What kind of prison? What kind of charge? What are the sentence recommendations? What can we get rid of? What can we make better? And then you've got wants as a criminal defense. Oh, we want to protect records. There's a different level of the desire during the process of negotiating or trying the case. And very clearly, the state had the goods on him to a level that they could really lean on him for that information.
Because
And
they had
that's
all the information, sorry to interrupt, they had all the information in his house about all of the defrauding that he had done with the first victim and how he wrote the bank and how he got the money and what he did to get the money, and I think that makes a difference. But Josh, he got almost 400 years. Was
yeah.
it different in the 1990s versus what it is now? Because that, to me, that's not a good plea deal. You got almost 400 years in prison.
It would be a really different issue now. And we see that arc when it comes to how we empower prosecutors to negotiate cases. When we've got things like the felony murder rule, which here in Georgia, if there's a death, it doesn't matter that you didn't pull the trigger. It didn't matter that you didn't drive the car. You can just be along for the ride. But if a death occurred and a felony occurred, you're hooked and you're looking at life. And it's not if we go, no, it's the judge turn around going, sorry, you got convicted, there's your life. Using those hard stop powers is a tool that's been developed to assist prosecution, but at the same time, it allows an enormous amount of abuse, and it limits how exactly the state can negotiate in order to get this kind of information. When the state's negotiating with someone who's going to prison forever, who is going to die in prison, which George died in prison. when he got 395 years, he was going nowhere. And he kind of knew that. So there's a bunch of negotiations that go on about, hey, how, if in any way possible, can you squeak out some sort of concession for your client? And that can include, hey, I'm going to tell you where the body is. Because getting that body information for the family,
It's huge.
it is, I know everybody goes, oh, it's no, it's huge.
Yeah, it's
Being
huge.
able to get closure, psychologically, it's one of the most important things that can happen for you to process your trauma. Unresolved trauma is the fountain for so many of the problems we have today.
Yeah, boy, do I agree with that. So, in talking about any of the seven deadly sins, and again, in this one, envying what he doesn't have, so he just took it. How does it go? Why is enough never enough? And here's what I mean by that. He had a good thing going, and he could have taken, now, he depleted a lot of the funds. So, granted, he was out of money, but he could have budgeted theoretically. He could have done things differently. So, he could have lived off the monies from his first victim who had a trust fund instead of saying, blowing all the money, running out of it, and then saying, well, I'll just do it again to get more money. Why is enough never enough with some of these guys?
Oh, one of the problems that we have as analysts of this is we import our own framework into their decision process.
That's my mistake.
And you're Judge
Not me.
Ashley. You never make these. You never sit there at dinner table and be like, well, I could go kill somebody and get a
Yeah.
couple extra $1,000 a month. That's a good no. And it's a problem I have. It's a problem that whenever we're talking about these cases, this wasn't my decision process, and it sure as hell wasn't Judge Ashley. We would look at that and go, hey, that's a nice person. Let's not murder them for a couple $1,000s a month and go on a life on the lam and defraud them. No. So you have to work with their logic in the way that they find it. And for whatever reason, George and Noreen found themselves where this appeared to be some sort of reasonable, logical idea. I don't believe this was a necessary crime of passion. It's not one where he's walking in on a sexual tryst no. And that's why we punish those and analyze those differently. This is much more insidious because of its premeditated nature. And Judge, premeditation is always going to aggravate punishment.
Yeah.
And that's what happened here. There was this not a passionate issue or a no, this was just money. And that's filthy. And that's how we know it's envy.
Yeah.
That's how we know it's envy going to greed, because it's something someone else has that George and Noreen want.
Yeah.
And that's how they made a plan, executed the plan, and we find ourselves here.
So you brought up another good point in this. You said Noreen a couple of times. That's his wife. We know she was younger. I saw a few pictures. She's beautiful. All right. So how does she play into this? Because we know she too did get charges, was convicted, and that's for the financial aspect of it. So for whatever reason, whether it was a plea deal, whether they didn't have evidence, whether she wasn't involved with the actual killings, who knows? But she was involved in all the financial piece. So when you see a couple like this, and they remained married, so many of the cases, to your point, Josh, that we cover, it is always around, right? Cheating or divorce, custody, all those nasty issues that are emotional in relationships. These two stayed married and were really, I think, cohorts in committing these crimes.
And remember, she did her time and got out.
Yeah, that's true.
She did her time and got out. He died in prison. And as you were talking about that, my head goes, oh boy, here's the trouble spot, because we're dealing with some really sticky cultural issues, including misogyny, including sexism, including the role of women. And our system doesn't have a good history there. We tend, as a society, to blame women less and to put a lot of emphasis into the man dominating dynamics. And for good reason. Historically, it's been a male-dominated society. If you think about how the Equal Rights Amendment and women's rights specifically have changed, go back 100 years, and it's unbelievable. Go back a couple hundred years. It's a shockingly different universe we existed, and that's reflected in our criminal justice process. So what we had here was, the guy had to have been the one in charge. He had to have been the one driving this. And as a defense attorney representing someone like Nori, I'm going to lean hard into that. I'm going to go trad wife like crazy. Yep, not my client, the missus. She barely has a personality and a voice. She's a set of aprons and a baby man, and she didn't have any choice in this. She just went along because that's going to be a successful path to mitigation, especially if you're going to include a little bit of corroboration and cooperation with, yes, that's my husband. He did that on this day. These are the monies. These are the discussions that we had.
Right.
But that belies the fact she's 100% an accessory. Is she as guilty for these deaths because she knew what was happening, went along, didn't stop? She had potentially the last opportunity to prevent murders. How do we fit that into our criminal justice system? What obligation does she have to go tell the authorities?
Right.
Because on the other end of that, she has the right as a spouse to spousal privilege, which in virtually every single state would prevent her from being forced to testify against her husband. And that dynamic comes in huge.
It comes in huge, but how do we know she wasn't manipulating him? That's the other thing. You can look at the tradition and find you also have women who married, let's be honest, for the financial support and security. And they expect that from their husband. They expect that from their man. And here you have a circumstance where she may have said, I don't care how you do it. I'm not living a life where we have to scrape by. That's not what I'm interested in. So there's a whole dynamic there we don't know, but you never know. That could be part of it.
Absolutely. And think about as a defense how you're going to spin that story, just like you illustrated, Judge. What if it's really her? What if he's the big dumb George from the book? Oh, yeah, no, whatever you want. Oh, pretty lady. I'll tell you, men are dumb. I'm dumb as a box of rocks chemically. We lose the ability to make good decisions when we are highly interested in continuing the species, let's just say. And some terrible decisions get made. So, depending on the dynamic between these two co-defendants, what happens if suddenly George turns around and goes, oh, I was just following directions. It was her. She wanted all the money because of her, whatever, unrestrained shopping trips and gambling, whatever. You can absolutely tell more than one story. It just is culturally easier for us to accept. Up, George is the man. He's the provider. He has the burden of making sure the family has money. So he's going to be the one planning the murder. I don't know about y'all. That's not the way relationship dynamics work these days. And it'd be a different case now as opposed to 30 years ago. This would be approached very differently. I think there'd be a lot more equality between the charges and more scrutiny and inquiry over what her role actually was, unless George was going to do a full confession exonerating. Because the state now doesn't just go after one. Sure, lots of cases, they get one perpetrator and that's no, they tend to really go after people a lot more broadly and share that responsibility. And if prosecuted today, I don't know if Noreen would have gotten the same.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. I think that time does change everything, and that's one of the aspects practicing law and defending criminals. Let's talk about that. I've never held that job, but I value, especially as a former judge, the import of an attorney who can do it because it protects all of our rights. It's that slippery slope. If you don't protect the rights of the worst, well, then our rights are also going to erode. And
Absolutely.
But having said that, let's lean into the horribleness of these facts. I mean, come on, a paraplegic, you shoot in the neck and naked, put him in a field and he's not even dead. How do you represent? How do you live with yourself representing someone who's accused of doing such a heinous crime?
Criminal defense lawyers never get taught emotional fatigue and emotional trauma because we're too busy getting trained to be lawyers. And the emotional connection and the emotions of practicing law need to go from the back of the education train to the front, because the education and ability to deal with these kinds of emotional traumas is most important when you're talking about being a successful and zealous advocate for someone. Very luckily, my job's in the Constitution. I smile about that all the time because You don't like what I do, you don't like my client? Man, the one ad for what I do, real easy to find. And without a strong, robust, aggressive criminal defense, the Constitution knows we will be subject to abuse. The Constitution knew that without testing leadership constantly with smart, educated, sophisticated people, the authorities will eventually jump the shark and abuse the population. And that's why criminal defense attorneys not only are explicitly referenced and needed in the Constitution, it's why the system holds us so sacred. It's why the system forces us to be involved and gives us ethical requirements. If I don't do my job, I'm failing not just the client, I'm literally failing the Constitution. That's an onus when you get up in the morning. And it's how you also justify the work that we do, because I'm not defending the person's actions because I agree with them. And I have, with many clients, been completely polarized. I've represented known bigots and racists. I've represented people of every political stripe. I've represented people who find the system I value and have promised value to be the devil and awful because it's secular. There are so many different ways that people want to attack what we do, but then we go home and we say, I'm doing this for the system. I'm not defending what someone has done as much as I'm making the state carry their burden and do their job. Because that's the heart of our system, is the state has to do their job.
So does the why matter to you? Does the why the person did it? Does the why of a George who wants and desires and is so envious of what his wealthy people in his life have that come across his path that he decides it's okay to murder and steal and commit fraud to get their wealth? So does that why matter to you as a criminal defense attorney?
It matters to me for the point of how we're going to defend the case and doing my job best. But I don't excuse or approve the personal choices in my client's life. And that goes into client management as much as it goes doing my job, because very often your client and your professional role, they're conflicting. I'm a bad news bringer. I'm not going in there very often and saying, hey, yeah, we're going to walk. And no, the conversation, especially for appointed lawyers, and that's a big dynamic many people miss, is the difference between appointed or public defense work and private work, because it's completely different dynamic. In most of our most egregious crimes, they're public defenders. People that are accused of this don't necessarily have the funds for private counsel, so those public defenders are assigned. It's go to work. You've got 50 clients. This just happens to be one of them. And when you're working on so many of the similar issues, you're going to develop how to manage those clients. That includes clients that want to obstruct, want to stop the process because they don't understand its inextricability. And they're going to throw up every barrier. They're going to not participate. They're going to try to fire lawyers. They're going to try to do all these. It's systems dealt with hundreds of thousands of people, though. And it's got a solution for no matter your problem, Daryl Brooks. It just does. So when it comes to working with the facts, I don't need to know a lot about the why you did some until we get to that part of story development. My
Because
initial
without the
job.
why for a jury, Josh, without the why for a jury, juries often, I think, will not come to the conclusions they would if they knew why a person did it. They want to know. It's not an element of a crime that you have to prove, that the state has to prove. But still, the why makes a significant difference for a jury to understand. Okay, in this case, the why is because he resented they had it, he didn't, so he decided he'd kill them to get it. Granted, he entered a plea, but without that why, I think it can be harder to try a case.
Oh, without that why, the state has a very difficult time, and the defense has a very difficult time, because it's what the jury wants more than anything. Juries can accept it. Oh, there's a dead person. Money's missing. There were drugs. Now they're on, whatever the facts are. Those are much more easy for a jury to process. What the jury struggles with is that why, is that the intent issue. And oftentimes audiences and people listening to trials miss where the focus is there. But the jury's going back there at some point, acknowledging what facts they've seen. And the question becomes, why? Why did this happen? And so you've got to address that and hopefully come up with an answer. The trick is changing the perspective of the jury so that they can understand how and why your client did whatever they did.
Right.
Because that's the betrayal. Every single criminal case involves betrayal. Every single trial has betrayal. It's identifying the betrayal and understanding that betrayal isn't necessarily an open-faced rug pull. No, that betrayal can be very different. That betrayal can be culture betraying you, making promises that didn't come true. It can be a community betrayal of, putting you on this direction only to make sure that you don't succeed. We see that with a lot of urban kids who basically are put on a pathway that eventually guarantees a negative law enforcement interaction. And you can tell in talking with them, are they pissed off or are they, this is just what's going to happen? Because your front, your facilitation with the criminal justice system has a lot to do with where you're from and who you are and where you come out of. My
Also for
family,
wrongful convictions. I just have to interrupt you. I think that's also true for wrongful convictions, right?
Yeah.
Frequently based on things like race.
Oh, absolutely. And it's gotten to the point where it's sad how acceptable it is in lots of communities that the wrong result's going to happen. In a lot of society, we go, oh, our system is fantastic, but doesn't make mistakes because it's 12 jurors and they have, well, that's your perspective. Being raised in middle class, upper class, proper, so those aren't the people that go on trial. You talk to people that are in economically disadvantaged or historically scrutinized and targeted demographics, they're going to turn around and say, no, people get convicted wrongfully and harassed all the time. I see it. It's awful because judges will recognize, no, that's a black guy driving after dark. Because for decades, that was a joke. What's probable cause? Black guy in a Cadillac. And that it's awful. I can't believe I'm even saying that now. That was something people would talk about and joke about in court during my career. I've been practicing law 20 years. The difference in recognition of structural issues has gone so far because even the state knows now that the fundamental basis of the prosecution system derives in some part from controlling the lower classes. And we can't get rid of that. We have to deal with the criminal justice system that we have and make it better, even though when we go back into history, it is based on all kinds of cultural values that we now find abhorrent, such as holding down lower classes and races and targeting people. If you don't think that law enforcement hasn't been used to manipulate society, that's why law enforcement exists to some degree.
And they still do it. And it still bothers me. It still bothers me, some of the techniques that the Supreme Court has said are allowed by law enforcement. And I watch it and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're tricking them. They're pretending like DNA results are on that piece of paper in front of them. And they're not. But that's actually allowed.
It's allowed. And in fact, it's important that we preserve law enforcement tools while also preserving our fundamental constitutional rights.
Right.
In
That
the
balance.
big gang case right now in Georgia, the YSL case,
YSL.
one of the issues is truthfulness of police officers during investigations and interrogations, because a lot of the interrogations have law enforcement lying to people. Literally, just lie on video in the room with the other officers, lying to people in order to get them to cooperate. And that's allowed. Law enforcement
That's allowed.
kind of freedom of speech. You're trying to get information, man. You don't have an obligation to tell the person you're interrogating the truth, do you? What about whether they're a suspect or whether they're a defendant? Those rules, it's a moving target. But we now value the ability to lie to the public in the best interest of law enforcement.
Because they say, you know what they say, as well as I do, what they say is, hey, if you're telling the truth, it doesn't matter what we say to you. It doesn't matter what we lie to you about. If you're telling the truth, then it's not going to make a difference. So there's so much more we could talk about. I love you to death and I adore talking to you. Tell me any last thoughts, because as I look at this case, it's just, some cases we have to piece together and say, but why did they do it? Did they do it? Is the evidence there? Why would they commit this horrible crime? This one's so transparent on its face that it almost makes it worse to me. I'm like, boy, your envy got the better of you and you went down this road. And then at the end of the day, you chose to do the right thing in my mind and enter a plea and say, this is where you can find the remains. And at the end of the day, those are good things for our justice system. What are your last thoughts?
It gives me faith that our system continues to work and get better. It has to keep getting better. This is, like you said, clearly an envy-based crime involving want of what's not yours. That's an easy concept for our system to delineate and define. It's easy for people to understand. And the system did the right thing here because it recognized the loss of those victims and why they were victimized.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Josh Schiffer. I adore you, and I'm so grateful for your time today.
It's been an absolute honor and pleasure, Judge. I'll talk with you anytime. This is the stuff we're kind of nerds about. So this is easy.
Kind of, maybe kind of trial nerd,
Maybe,
kind of,
maybe
yeah,
just
a little bit. And we can tell our viewers, we go out to dinner and then no holds barred, and it's hours later and we're still talking this stuff. So,
And if this is the kind of stuff y'all love, we are super happy. Judge Ashley's been asking to do this for what I love talking with her. I love talking with y'all. I love that y'all are interested in this because this is our core community. This is the rules and regulations that make everything around us work. And a murder is connected to your property taxes as well as your zoning laws, as well. It's all
it's
this
all.
spider web
And I
of
think it's
how we
so,
interact.
yeah, and it's so important, Josh, for people to understand why things can happen the way they happen. When you see someone that you say, they absolutely did it. How did they possibly get off? How did they get 5 years for murder? Whatever it is, there are legal reasons. And understanding those doesn't mean it makes it feel okay, but makes you have a better reverence for the laws, the Constitution, and all of our rights.
There's always a reason it happened. You just need to find it.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Josh.